Hi, this is Scott. I really appreciate our sponsors because they make the show possible. Today's show is sponsored by Telerik. Create compelling app experiences across any screen with the Telerik platform. Telerik's end-to-end platform uniquely combines industry-leading UI tools with cloud services to simplify the entire app development cycle. Telerik offers everything .NET developers need to build quality apps faster. Try it free at telerik.com/platform. That's telerik.com/platform.
From HanselMinutes.com, it's Hansel Minutes, a weekly discussion with web developer and technologist Scott Hanselman. This is Lawrence Ryan announcing show number 497. In this episode, Scott talks with Kenton Varda about his startup, Sandstorm.io.
Hi, this is Scott Hanselman. This is another episode of Hansel Minutes. Today I'm talking with Kenton Varda, who's a co-founder and lead developer on Sandstorm at Sandstorm.io. How are you?
Great.
Thanks for chatting with me today. When I saw Sandstorm for the first time, I went through the demo, the try me area online, and it was kind of so fast and so easy, I just assumed that it was somehow faked. Can you explain what it is and why it's interesting?
Yeah, so Sandstorm is a radically easier way to run a personal server or a private cloud. So what you saw there is you started a fresh Sandstorm server and you installed apps into it, much like you would install apps on your phone through an app store, all through point and click. And they just start up and they run just like that. And the goal is that individual people should be able to run their own servers rather than having the developers of the web apps that you're using running the servers for you. Both to give you better privacy, but also to make it much easier to make it easier for developers to write apps because they no longer have to run those servers. And so, there's a lot of open source apps out there that people can't really use today because you have to run your own server to use them, and no one really wants to spend the time to do that. This makes those accessible to everybody.
Yeah, it seems like if you tell people what you just said, techies will go, well, no, it's not that big of a deal. You just register a domain. But normal human beings may very well have a need for an application. Think about how complicated it is just to start your own blog. And companies like Medium and Facebook exist for that very reason, that it was really, really hard to register a domain, hook it up to a web server, and put an app there. And here we are pouring our words into Medium.
Yep. Yeah, and you should be able to set that up for yourself.
So is this not just making developers' lives easier, but you anticipate that normal humans should be able to think about the web like an app store, but an open source app store?
Yes. So with Sandstorm, and it's important to make this very clear, the developers do not run the server. It's the end user that does. So you are, as a developer, shipping an app to them for them to run. So you don't have to carry a pager or anything. But
so we say private cloud. Yep. It's fun to say cloud. I'm old enough.
Some people love it. Some people hate it.
Yeah, I'm old enough to remember when a cloud was just the Linux box in your server, in your closet, rather.
Yep.
So, for example, and I'll just use my Synology as an example, but my Synology is a little Linux machine that's literally sitting in my closet. I've always been able to SSH into it, but I have to admit that I haven't really put apps on it a lot until they had an app store. I think there are probably people who do have servers or can get a Linux server, but that's as far as they can go. Do I have to go and SSH into machines to do this? How much technical stuff do I have to know in order to run Sandstorm?
Yeah, so the goal is you never use SSH, you never use text editors when you're using Sandstorm. I like I've had the ability to run my own server for the past 15 years. I've had the know-how, but I haven't really done it because it's just a lot of work. So to install Sandstorm, if you want to install it on your own physical machine, there is still a step where you have to run something in the shell.
Sure.
But we're working on making that even easier. And you also have the option of using a managed hosting service that hosts starts up Sandstorm for you. For those who don't want to take that one step in the shell. But once you've got it installed, then everything else is point and click.
And you never think about it again.
Yeah, pretty much. It self-updates everything.
So then people who are listening might say, well, wait a second, isn't that Docker? Didn't he just describe Docker but gave it a different name?
Well, no, because with Docker, Docker is a tool for sysadmins and for developers to launch their services using a shell and using config files. It is not something that is aimed at end users, non-technical end users. A non-technical end user cannot run their own Docker instance.
Well, and arguably some technical users can't either. I'm still struggling a little bit with the Docker client, the command line.
Yeah.
So then in a world where we've got, virtual machines and we've got Linux containers, we've got Docker, we've got Heroku, Git deploy. A couple of years ago, Git deploy was like the peak of app deployment. Do you think that something like Sandstorm is like, that's the ideal? You should just be able to have a website that you can go to administer all of your applications, and both authors and people who run these apps just don't have to think about the administration anymore. The administrivia.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of boilerplate that web developers have to deal with today. It's not just running the servers, but it's also, authentication, sharing models, access control, security, making sure that they've locked everything down, perhaps encrypting user data. All of that is stuff that Sandstorm can take care of, in the Sandstorm world. And so as an app developer, all you have to do is focus on, your business logic. Mm-hmm. And as, an example of that, so we have an app on Sandstorm called We Can. It's at the very top of the App Store if you look. And what it is it's similar to, it's a Kanban board, so it's similar to Trello. And in my opinion, it is better than Trello. Like they've produced something that, I mean, it's pretty similar, but, they've got all the features. I prefer using it over Trello.
Mm-hmm. But there's probably not a hosted version, right? That you can't, like, I can go to Trello.com and they host it for me.
Right.
And if I want my Kanban board.
With We Can, you of course have to run it on your own server, but you can run it on Sandstorm. And the interesting thing to me is that this was an app developed by two guys, one in Turkey and one in France, basically in their spare time. And they have matched the quality of competing SaaS apps, with just that, SaaS apps that have, presumably dozens of developers on them. So that's how much easier it is to develop an app in Sandstorm.
And I think that the significant aspect of this is that if you were going to start up a company today, you'll go and you'll get your Google Apps, your Office 365, you'll get Trello, you'll go to GitHub. Mm-hmm. Suddenly, your little company of one or two people has dependencies on 12, 15, 20, software as a service vendors. Mm-hmm. And you're going to be sending them, a couple bucks a month. There's the monetary aspect of things, but there's also the control aspect of things. You might decide that, foo.bar is the best bug tracking software ever. And then one day you wake up and that has failed and they've gone out of business. Uh-huh. You have this dependency chain. But if you bring that cloud internally and manage it yourself with open source apps, then you have a lot more control, right?
Right. When it comes to SaaS, it's one thing to decide to use Google or Microsoft products. It's another thing to decide to use the products of a small startup that you don't know how far they're going to go. Mm-hmm. And also you don't really know what their security practices are like. Like you can be pretty sure that Google is good at security, but some random startup, who knows? Mm-hmm. And so, with Sandstorm, you're handling, Sandstorm handles a lot of the security. And actually, that's a whole nother conversation that we should get into at some point. But
yeah, I do want to cover the security aspect of things, mm-hmm. but the control part is, I think, very, very interesting because mm-hmm. if you've got your small startup in the old days, pre-personal cloud, someone had to be IT. Someone had to manage that server. Someone had to think about that server. Yes. That server had I call it psychic weight that has nothing to do with the business.
Right. So, one of the reasons I think that SaaS has caught on in the past 10 to 15 years is because it's been so much easier to set up and use. You don't have to be technical to register for one of these accounts. And I think that it is entirely possible for us to get the same ease of use with quote unquote on-prem software with the right platform under it that makes it really easy to install things. And so that is what Sandstorm's trying to do. And once it's, as easy to use on-prem software and your own server as it is to use SaaS, why would anyone choose SaaS? I get this question a lot. People say, well, why would anyone care about running their own server? Just like back in the 70s, people said, why would anyone want to have a personal computer? But if it's equally, all other things being equal, why would you not want to keep your data on your own machine?
That's a really interesting question. Like, my email has been in Google Apps for, I don't know, forever, 8 years, right? Mm-hmm. And my files are in Dropbox, and I'm okay with that. But my personal photos are in my closet. I have them backed up to CrashPlan. But I've never really felt comfortable sending all that data out when I'm just going to look at it internally anyway. Mm-hmm. So it's control. It's a sense of safety. There's a sense of, I think it's control, isn't it?
Yeah. And flexibility and being able to choose, which apps you run. All these SaaS services, when you're signed up to, 10 different SaaS services, none of them usually, integrate with each other really well. Like, they'll all integrate specifically with Google, but they won't integrate with each other. And part of that is just because it's kind of hard for them to deal with the access control and implementing OAuth and such. Mm-hmm. Whereas if everything's under one roof and one login system, as it is with Sandstorm, then it is much easier to integrate apps.
Okay. So let's get a little more technical and get some context. So people who are listening probably are familiar with VMs, and they realize that they could, if they wanted to, fire up a VM, put a web server on a machine, install an application, and they can do that now. They could go and do Docker. People may be listening and saying, well, Docker's fine. It's easy enough. Mm-hmm. What is Sandstorm? Does it sit on top of one of those things, or is it its own kind of container?
So we use the same Linux kernel features that Docker uses for containerization. We have our own containerization layer built on top of that. It's actually not very big. Like, it's pretty easy to use these system calls. So it's, a couple hundred lines of code. So we don't really think of that as a major feature of Sandstorm, but rather an implementation detail. But yeah, it's those same features.
Is this what's called LXC?
LXC is actually another set of scripts that sit on top of these same kernel features, but we use the system calls directly.
Okay. So you're using the containerization stuff that is built into Linux, and that, like you said, that's an implementation detail.
Yeah.
On your website, though, you call out security more than I've seen lightweight container systems call out before, because they always say that it's not a strong boundary like a virtual machine is. Why do you do that?
So most of those other container systems really are not good at sandboxing. We do a number of things that they don't do. The main things are attack surface reduction and designing a platform API that's actually sandboxable. So attack surface reduction means the Linux kernel has vulnerabilities found all of the time because it has an enormous API. And there's bugs in various system calls or other parts. And so like on basically a weekly or monthly basis, there is a new privilege escalation exploit found in the Linux kernel. And most of those will allow you to break out of a container. But on Sandstorm, we drastically reduce the Linux API by using setcomp BPF to disable a lot of system calls, exotic system calls that a web app has no business calling. We don't mount procfs. We don't mount sysfs. Those are huge interfaces that are not very well reviewed. The only devices visible in the container are null, 0, and urandom, which are very heavily used devices that are pretty simple and well reviewed. As a result, in the last year, I believe there's been one bug that possibly theoretically was a Sandstorm breakout, although no one was able to actually produce a working exploit on that one.
So would you believe that attack surface reduction is probably like the number one thing that anybody can do to make their site more secure?
Well, it's tricky because these things. So there is a constant tension between compatibility and security. So if you've disabled a bunch of system calls, there will be some apps that will want to use one of those, and they'll have to be tweaked to not use it and use something else. And that's why with something like Docker, where they want to run arbitrary off-the-shelf Linux apps, they can't really do that, or they can't set it up by default. Whereas we're willing to say, well, apps that are ported to Sandstorm do need to be tweaked slightly as part of the packaging process. So if they are doing one of these things, they need to stop. It's generally not hard to tweak them, but it is a thing that needs to be done.
This episode of Hansel Minutes is brought to you by Braintree, code for easy online payments. If you're building a mobile app and you're searching for a simple payment solution, check out Braintree. The Braintree V.0 SDK makes it easy to offer multiple mobile payment types, so you can start accepting PayPal, Apple Pay, Bitcoin, Venmo, credit cards, and more, all with a single integration. One small snippet of code and you're set up in less than 10 minutes. If you don't have time, you can give them a call. They'll even handle the integration for you and walk you through it. The SDK supports 7 languages: .NET, Node, Java, Perl, PHP, Python, and Ruby. Elegant code, clear documentation. To learn more and for your first $50,000 in transactions fee-free, go to braintreepayments.com/Hanselman. That's braintreepayments.com/Hanselman. So on the one hand, with Docker or something like that, you've got we'll run pretty much anything just as it is. And then there's the potential for someone to make a more App Store permissive. Like, when an application comes down on an Android device and says, hey, I really need to talk to your microphone, someone could say, no microphone apps. Or if you're going to do microphone apps, talk this API. Or you could add something in Sandstorm to ask permission. Yeah,
so that's the other part of making something that's sandboxable, is that you need to have a platform API that actually makes sense for sandboxing, where the app has some way to request permissions that the user is able to grant in a sensible way. So, take the example of an app that needs to send notification emails. On a typical, VM or Docker solution, you might need to give it port 25, ability to open port 25 on your SMTP server. And an end user doesn't know what that means. On Sandstorm, instead it would be, I request the ability to send emails. And then the Sandstorm UI will come up and guide the user through choosing what email address to send as, perhaps if and this is stuff that we're still working on, but if the user has some domains attached to their Sandstorm server, then Sandstorm will say, okay, choose a domain. Okay, now type an email address. Okay, now we'll grant specifically this email address to the app. And at the low level, the way we represent that is through something called Captain Proto, which is our RPC communications layer. And it makes it really easy to represent arbitrary permissions as an object reference that the app receives and then can start making calls to.
And just as a small aside for people who might be curious about that, Captain Proto is it protocol buffers plus? Is it V2, or is it an entirely new concept on top of protocol buffers?
Well, I like to think of it as a successor to protocol buffers. So, I used to work at Google for a while. I was the one-man protobuf team. I was largely responsible for open sourcing protobufs. Cap'n Proto is a replacement for protocol buffers. That is, so after I left Google, I worked on Cap'n Proto, and it's all the things that I would have wanted to do, but I couldn't do on protobufs because Google had too much data in the existing format. So Cap'n Proto is infinity times faster than protobufs, I like to say. The reason being that the wire format is also appropriate as an in-memory format. So when you read in a message, you don't have to go through a parsing step. You can just start using it.
Is it infinity times faster all the time or just on the read? Like on the write, someone had to write it though, right?
On both read and write, because you build the message, through the Cap'n Proto library, you build the message in memory in exactly the format in which it's going to be written out. So there's no serialization step.
I see. So it's a mem copy kind of a situation. You're stacking your Tetris blocks as they're coming down neatly with minimal, if or any work.
Right. And yeah, once you write it out, it's just a mem copy, or you can do things like memory map in a file and read it as a Cap'n Proto structure, and only the parts of the file that you actually look at will be loaded in from disk. So there's a lot of neat things you can do with that. And then on top of that, there's the RPC layer, which protocol buffers, at least in my time, we weren't able to release an RPC system on top of it. But Cap'n Proto has a built-in RPC system. And the interesting thing about it is that it's object capability based, which is a branch of security theory. But the basic idea is object references are a first-class type. You can send someone a message that contains a reference to an object that they didn't know about before. When they receive the reference, they implicitly receive permission to use the object, whereas before they received the reference, they had no ability to address the object in the first place. And on top of that, you can build all kinds of complex interactions between mutually non-trusting parties and have it be secure.
And just for folks that are interested in that separate conversation, Cap'n Proto is under the Sandstorm IO organization on GitHub, and it's CAPN, Cap'n Proto, when you go off and Google to find that. One other thing that is fundamental, it appears, to Sandstorm is Meteor. Is that because Meteor is a favorite thing, and you wrote much of it in Meteor? Even though I understand that Sandstorm can have apps written in any language.
Yeah. So it's not. I wouldn't call it fundamental.
Okay.
The thing about Meteor is that so for Sandstorm can run apps written in any tech stack that runs on Linux. But early on, we wrote tools specifically for Meteor that made it easier to take a Meteor app and package it for Sandstorm, because Meteor apps are laid out in a certain predictable way. So that makes it easier to write a tool around it. Whereas the more general tool requires a bit more configuration to build your app. So, and I do like Meteor as a way to write a high quality reactive web app quickly. We used it for the Sandstorm front end, and generally that's been a good experience for me. But I would also say that more recently we've started developing tools targeting other specific tech stacks. So the Meteor advantage is decreasing at this point by virtue of the others catching up.
I see. So then if anyone who has a tech stack or is interested in a tech stack who might be listening, they could go and look at how the implementation of the of Meteor or the other apps that create Sandstorm packages, and they could do that themselves. I could do this with .NET on Linux and make Sandstorm packaging tools.
Yeah. So there are sort of Swiss Army knife tool is something called Vagrant SPK, meaning you use Vagrant to run a Linux VM and then create SPK, which are Sandstorm package files with it. And it has basically configurations for a bunch of different stacks, and we are continually adding more stacks and improving those existing configurations. So yeah, it would be cool to have a .NET stack support in there. But it is also possible to do things in a general way where Vagrant SPK does not have to know about your stack already.
Very cool. Well, I can definitely make the .NET one happen. So that we'll have that conversation offline. That's a good idea. So is Sandstorm, is it a company or an open source project or both?
It is both. So we are a startup. We have received seed funding. But we're also open source. So the version of Sandstorm that runs on a single machine, what you would want as an individual user is completely open source, Apache 2 license. We are working on an enterprise product, which will be how we fund things. Basically, features that only companies with a lot of money would want, we will put in that product and sell it. And one of those is the ability to take a cluster of machines and treat it as a single large Sandstorm instance and have it sort of self-manage the load balancing. And that is our managed hosting product is built on that, and we'll eventually be selling that. Yeah.
Okay. So then I can, as a personal user, I can do this now. I can take my Linux machine and I can set up my own private cloud with Linux at home or whatever.
Yep.
If an enterprise, that's going to be your enterprise product, and I could go and do that. Now, does that mean I can host it myself, or do you use your managed hosting?
So you can do either. We have a managed hosting service for people who don't want to run their own physical machine. But it's up to you.
Is that weird though? Because I thought it was like a personal cloud, but now I'm back to hosting with you.
Yeah. So, we get this question a lot. The thing is that even if you're using our managed hosting, we still aren't the app developer. So you still have the separation between the developer and the host. And by having that separation, you as the user get a lot more power to run the apps that you choose. And moreover, if you decide at some point that you would rather have your own machine, you can easily move all of the apps from the managed hosting to your own because it's the same set of apps because it's Sandstorm in both places.
I see. So portability and vendor lock-in, those are the important things. And there is total portability and there's no vendor lock-in.
Exactly. And yeah, the purpose of the managed hosting for us is actually not so much about making money, but rather, making Sandstorm available to as many users as possible, because there are a lot of users who just aren't going to run a physical machine. But we want that ecosystem to be as large as possible so that the people who do run their own machine get high quality apps.
So to the point about that ecosystem, if I've got an application, like I've got a blog that I wrote in some language, what do I need to do if I want to get that into the Sandstorm marketplace and make it available to the ecosystem?
So you will want to go use Vagrant SPK. And there's documentation online at docs.sandstorm.io. Basically you are going to, create an SPK package, that contains, all of your dependencies. It's similar to like a Docker image or a VM image. And then you submit that by doing Vagrant SPK publish to our app market, and we basically look over it just to make sure there's no typos or obvious missing information, and then we approve it.
And do you, from a security perspective, again, it's compartmentalized. So could I publish an evil thing and it would make its way up into the Sandstorm marketplace as an evil thing, or would it matter?
So you could publish an evil thing, but the app runs inside a sandbox where it's segregated from the rest of the system. And so you would have to publish an evil thing and convince users to give it permissions that it can do evil things with. Generally we're more worried about apps that are buggy because people aren't good at writing, or a lot of app developers are just not any good at making their apps secure. And we want to make sure that on Sandstorm, you don't really have to worry about that because Sandstorm will isolate the app in such a way that those bugs don't matter. So as an example, every Etherpad document you create, which is it's a document editor, is run in a separate container, isolated from all the others. So that means that a bug in Etherpad, which allows someone who has access to one document to get access to others, doesn't matter on Sandstorm. and only the people that you've shared that document to through the Sandstorm interface can possibly get access. So through things like that, we've seen lots of bugs in individual apps that just don't affect Sandstorm.
Very cool. What do most apps do for databases?
Yeah, so the app gets a slice of file system to store to, and can run whatever database it wants. So we generally recommend SQLite because generally, since it's one document per container, you're dealing with a small amount of data, and it just doesn't make sense to run a large database. But we do see apps that use MySQL or Mongo or anything else. You just put it in your package along with your front end.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything that you wouldn't run in Sandstorm? Is there anything that's too big or too intense or too whatever that you'd be like, yeah, that's probably not what we're for?
Yeah. So Sandstorm is not intended to run SaaS apps, meaning apps where you're primarily like, you wouldn't. So an app where your users are external and they don't know that Sandstorm is behind it, or an app where you want to scale up to 100 million users, you would not run on that on Sandstorm. Because Sandstorm is always supposed to be interacting with the user and running small scale instances of things. And we think there's plenty of infrastructure out there already, specifically for the case of scaling to 100 million users. And that's just not a very interesting space for us, even though we could probably make Sandstorm have features to support that. It's not what we're aiming at.
Okay. So people can get involved with in a number of ways of increasing deepness. They can get on your announcements mailing list, right? They can go check out the marketplace, which is called Oasis, which is an awesome name, by the way.
Well, the managed hosting service is Oasis, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. So forgive me. So the managed hosting service is Oasis. The marketplace is just what URL?
Apps.sandstorm.io. It's just Sandstorm App Marketplace.
Very cool. And you've got a really active community on GitHub. You've got lots of stars and lots of forks. What do you think people are doing with all of these forks? Does anyone run off and try to do something really crazy with Sandstorm?
Yeah. So there's a pull request that I need to get to this week that I'm pretty excited about, where someone has added support for WebDAV, so that you can host he's actually got the OwnCloud file sync client syncing to a Sandstorm app that I guess he wrote himself. This requires that the HTTP bridge between them support the full WebDAV protocol, which is an extension to HTTP. So I'm excited about getting that merged in so that people can do file sync to Sandstorm.
Yeah, that is pretty slick. In a world of REST where we're only thinking of a couple of HTTP verbs, there's a whole lot of methods that you have to do to make WebDAV, which we think of as being kind of an older thing, but it's still extremely useful. And that definitely would be great for businesses. Mm-hmm. Very cool. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today.
Thanks.
So again, you can check out Sandstorm at sandstorm.io. This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.